House Speaker Mike Johnson took to the airwaves this weekend to sound the alarm over cheating in this year's presidential election. He told CBS News' Margaret Brennan that he's worried about non-citizen voters tipping the election.
You've had really great work done in most of the states to shore up their systems and to make sure that we have a free and fair election. Now, look, as President Trump says all the time, and I agree, our side, what we say at the rallies you've heard is we've got to make it too big to rig. I think that's really important. I think there is going to be some cheating in this election. I think non-citizens are going to vote. Look, case in point.
You know that
it
is against the law for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. That's established law.
Of course it is. Of course it is. But here's the problem. There's a number of states that are not requiring proof of citizenship when illegals or non-citizens register to vote.
I'm so sick of this argument. The conservatives in this country have been saying this for over 100 years. We have had conservatives using this rhetoric against the Irish, against the Polish, against the Italians, against the Greeks, against the Jews. We know Brennan Center has said 0.0000, I want to get the right number of zeros, this is 0.00001% of invalid voters because somebody's registration usually had to do with the green card, by the way, was improperly registered, have had illegal voting. Over the last 25 years, there have been fewer than 1,700 incidents, mostly due to registration errors because of green cards. This is insane that he is allowed to get away with this as the Speaker of the House, and that the Republicans are fine with it while they're simultaneously trying to win over Latinos, many of whom come from families who've immigrated in the last generation. I don't understand the rhetoric, how it keeps, it's just the old authoritarian playbook. The enemy is the other, it's not us.
Well, I don't know if it's authoritarian to say that only citizens should be voting, but I agree with you that there is not, no one has put forth evidence of widespread improper voting by illegal immigrants. Now, obviously, the voting procedures were very different last time because of the pandemic with the increasing prevalence of mail-in ballots. Pennsylvania, unfortunately, we had to wait a long time to find out whether the most important state had counted everything correctly. The bigger problem, so I disagree with Republicans that, you know, some vast wave of illegal immigrants voting for Democrats. I mean, again, this is a demographic, funny enough, the Latino men, the Republicans are suddenly doing much better with, so it's not even clear that if they were voting illegally, they'd be voting illegally, to vote for Kamala Harris. So it's a little bit confused. But where there is an impact in terms of the illegal immigrant population is just that population size, right? You have illegal migrants are disproportionately concentrated in blue states where they do count. They raise the population. They thus increase the overall share of the electoral college vote from places like California, New York, Illinois, also Texas, where that would be
Arizona,
then benefiting, yes,
Nevada?
In some states it benefits the Republicans, but overall it benefits the
Florida?
Democrats more because of California, New York, Illinois.
I actually don't think that math is right. I think they kind of balance each other out.
I've looked at it. It's not so one-sided, but it does on net benefit Democrats.
Are we just talking about, immigrant populations? Are we talking about legal immigrant populations? Or are we talking about, and it's hard to know the undocumented, we don't really have a firm number on that for the most part. We know people who have been trying to go through the system, DACA recipients, et cetera, but it's very hard to have a sense of what the accurate numbers are. It's been much more documented in the last, say, 2 or 3 years because we have amped up border response under both administrations. So we do have a sense of the incoming, how many folks are coming over the border, but we don't really have a sense of how many people are undocumented in this country. Maybe through some sorts of taxation. If they're working, they are paying taxes. So we do, in states like Florida and California, one of the reasons why we're pushing for ID laws is because we want to have a better sense of how many people are in this country that are, not technically legal, but might be, want to go through the system. Some folks have, if you're in a good blue state, you might have more assistance from the state and you're protected. So I just think it's interesting that Republicans are so against these voter ID laws when it probably suits them more in some of their arguments.
Against voter ID? Republicans are not against voter ID.
Oh, no, excuse me, voter ID laws. I mean ID laws, excuse me. Like the license laws, New York is having the ID laws that they're pushing for undocumented people. It's for many different reasons, but you'd think that that was something Republicans would want, and they're not. They're the ones pushing against it.
Sure, I think for voting, I think it's fine to that people got to be registered that there's going to be ID checks for voting. It doesn't seem like the biggest burden to me. Again, this is not my singular issue by any stretch of the imagination, because I don't think it ultimately matters very much. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask people to show a license to vote. You have to show a license to do all sorts of things, but is it a big issue? No, because again, Republicans have failed to demonstrate widespread evidence of widespread fraudulent voting that, by the way, that would only benefit the Democrats, because there's some fraudulent voting, but some people fraudulently vote for Republicans, some people fraudulently vote for Democrats. I think Republicans have constructed arguments that there's more fraudulent voting or voting of people who are somebody voting on your behalf when you're deceased in, like, Chicago or more, where there's corruption in big cities, that kind of thing. But some of that is just.
Are we going back to the Kennedy conspiracies?
What's the Kennedy conspiracy?
It was dead people were voting.
People, again, it's not a conspiracy theory. The Nixon-Kennedy election, right, did have actually a lot of problems, and there was some legitimate question about mob ties helping out the Kennedys. I don't think I'm saying anything I'm not allowed to say, right? That's a view that some people, mainstream people, hold. If I'm not mistaken.
But there is something to that we have heard these stories years and years and years over the years and keep in mind, the mob, as they said, was tied to unions, and unions were mostly people of color in that era. There were, especially when you look at Tammany Hall in New York, Tammany Hall represented immigrants and people of color. And at that time, you had white elites in the conservative party, whether it was Nixon or previous, back in New York, you just had a more conservative Democratic Party, that were fear-mongering. They were saying, these people are taking your jobs, joining unions. These people are not voting legally, even though a lot of them there had become legal, because they were the others. So this does go back to something psychologically that has been pushed on us over generations, and it's just modernized into this new version of fear-mongering. But as you said, there's no truth to it, but there wasn't truth to it really back then either. I mean, maybe a little bit more because it was harder to regulate, but the penalties are so severe that not only could somebody get a fine or be arrested and imprisoned, by the way, but they could be deported. And I think that's the last thing someone who is, not here legally wants to deal with is deportation.
You're not denying that there was there was some corruption among labor and bosses and organized crime, and not even specifically about voting in the presidential election, but in voting for who their leaders are and all that kind of these are my ancestors as much as anyone else's at this point. As I said earlier on the show, I'm descended from Italians who came over in the early part of the 20th century. So it's not racial or maligning like just black people or something. This is working class people of all backgrounds involved in labor. There was, some corruption there.
It was folks who were challenging the authority. I have this theory, if you go back to Tammany Hall in New York, they were fighting the elites, and they were using tactics that we would all think is corrupt, probably back then too.
Murder?
Tammany Hall wasn't, but at least some of the organized crime was. But simultaneously, you had the elites of like northern, uptown New York. And those were the elites who owned the big businesses, who didn't want to have unions, who wanted to oppress people, who wanted to keep wages down. It's just a reformation of the same dynamics. You have working people in this country who are angry at the elites for not giving them higher wages, for supporting, making safe working conditions. It's just evolved with different groups now and different language and also different parties.
All right, we'll be back with more Rising right after this.